संस्थापकाय च धर्मस्य सर्वधर्मस्वरूपिणे अवतारवरिष्ठाय रामकृष्णाय ते नमः। भज गोविन्दं भज गोविन्दं भज गोविन्दं भज गोविन्दं गोविन्दं भज मूढमते भज गोविन्दं भज गोविन्दं गोविन्दं भज मूढमते सम्प्राप्ते सन्निहिते काले सम्प्राप्ते सन्निहिते काले नहि नहि रक्षति दुःखकरणे नहि नहि रक्षति दुःखकरणे भज गोविन्दं भज गोविन्दं गोविन्दं भज मूढमते मूढजहि धनागमतृष्णा मूढजहि धनागमतृष्णा कुरु सद्बुद्धिं मनसि वितृष्णा कुरु सद्बुद्धिं मनसि वितृष्णा यल्लभसे निज।
I think many other sort of spiritual teacher, wonderful teacher, great sort of spiritual sort of practitioner. But I think compare Buddha's teaching, a little bit lesser because of the philosophical things. Buddha, great thinker, philosopher. Then one aspect of Buddha, I think some unique thing. Is Buddha taught us, oh my follower, monks, scholars should not accept my teaching out of faith, out of devotion. It's something unique. And rather thorough investigation and experiment. Through investigation and experiment, if my teaching then you see useful and something realistic or something, then you accept. I think the 2,600 years ago, you see that kind of thinking, putting much emphasis, reasons, experiment, not faith. It's wonderful. So I consider this one ancient Indian scientist.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Namaskar. All here to remember our esteemed friend, Munishwar Nath Ashish Ganju. Some of us called him Muni, many others called him Ashish. But, we have been friends for many, many years. There are a number of phases through which his life and work goes. And we've lost him suddenly. Many projects are left unfinished, and we have to collectively take them up again. So we are here together to pay our homage to his memory. And I have two of my very good friends here, Savyasaachi and Neelkanth Chhaya, to join me.
It's a great loss to us, because Ashish was really a multifaceted and multi-talented man. And I think I feel very indebted to him for many reasons. And I think most of us who are part of this meeting would feel the same. The best way to remember him is to celebrate his life and his works and what he stood for. So in that spirit, I would want to participate in this conversation and share what I learned from him about himself, his work, and the times he lived in.
In the anyone who had met Ashish would be touched by the wonderful sense of life that came through from him. Always intensely aware of his surroundings and the people around him, and so kind. And it's in this manner that I remember him as a human being of great depth and great compassion.
We have, Ashish was very proud of his study at the AA, in the mid 60s when London was a happening place and many things happened, and he made some wonderful friends. And yet he decided, and he wrote in his CV that he is returning to India for higher studies. And sure enough, he continued his higher studies in the villages, in all kinds of environments that you find in this country, learning from people, learning from friends, and learning through construction, actually getting involved in construction and developing the philosophical side of his and his contribution to work.
Yeah, and I think AA at that time, we can see two kinds of streams of thought. On one side, the avant-garde of all the people who are doing things, imagining a world which was completely different from what they knew. And the other part was those who were trying to connect to worlds which had not been talked about, such as villages in Africa or South America or India, and talking about the absolute sense of lived life. And I think Ashish partook of both of these, but he connected more to the sense of life that the ordinary human being in the world, the majority, and I think it's that human dimension which touched him at AA. And that's why coming to India for higher studies makes sense.
Whenever Ashish talked about his days in AA in England, he was very, very aware of the fact that Europe had just fought the Second World War, and Europe was still emerging from the trauma of the Second World War. And he was quite a part of the 1960s era in Europe, which was very, very vibrant, very creative, full of questions. And his sense of modernism, actually, his understanding of modernism comes from having witnessed this particular active and convivial and transformative part of the intellectual life. The 60s touched everybody intellectually, spiritually, and socially. And when Ashish came back to India, his words were that it was time for him to understand the limits of modernism and then to go on to his higher learning, to the ancient texts, as Narendra and Neelkanth said.
Dearest Nina, Chandini, Swear and Tara, and indeed all of the family. And I'm sure all of your friends will share with me some amazing memories of Muni over a long period as a close friend. Tess and I have explored that history, and now can see very clearly that it's a big task to really cover the full history. But for now, I'll just mention one thing and then hand over to Tess, who will read a tribute we've written together on Muni. The project, I think, speaks very clearly and loud as a near perfect place is the Domalin Nunnery at Dharmshala. This project, I think, has to join a list of some of the greatest and enduring parts of civilization. And I name places like Piazza San Marco in Venice, or that wonderful piazza in Siena, and the streets, parts of New Delhi, and of course not least an enormous historic and wonderful chunk bar. Domalin was conceived with all the love and care that an architect should give, and is actually amazing if you think that one guy thought through that enormously enjoyable place. And today it stands pretty well as it was built, and I have to say those wonderful enormous corbels that give it that incredible character of timelessness is just sublime. Anyway, over to Tess. Hope to see you all soon. Bye.
Munishwar Nath Ashish Ganju, Muni, was both a practicing architect and philosopher on architecture and urbanism who over 60 years developed and refined a unique way of thinking and making modern architecture based on an intense understanding of human needs and wishes using anthropological, archaeological and other habitat study. His projects were archetypal, always a clear synthesis of brief and context, and not in the least concerned with typologies or any other form of authoritarian ideology. I first met Muni at the AA in the mid-60s. However, it was only after I'd returned from a year out in India and Pakistan that we fully connected. He had already established some burgeoning and firm friendships with some of the group I'd left in 1964, especially Nicholas Weaver, Mike Glickman, Hayward Hill, Robin Sutcliffe and David Osborne. He had apparently settled in seamlessly and with his symbiotic, keen and friendly manner had become a member of the group. Having at first hardly noticed him amongst the rest, or his being an Indian, we exchanged notes on my very recent experiences in his homeland. It was, as I now know, a gentle beginning in what became a lifelong dialogue on everything. Especially the Indian subcontinent and how such cultures absorb the ways and universal demands of a modern world without compromising its ethnicity or its particular part in what was to become some kind of universal reality we all, to a degree, had to identify with and now refer to as global. Muni had studied the urbanism of Patrick Gaddis, a Scottish geographer, philanthropist and pioneering town planner, who from 1917 to 1919 had served and practiced town planning in India, where he introduced the concept of region to architecture and planning and coined the term conurbation. Gaddis had elaborated on neotechnics, a near-to-the-earth science with rules relating to the expanding field of environmental knowledge as the way of remaking a world apart from over-commercialization and money dominance. This was an important part of Muni's grounding and openness to the possible and pragmatic. Muni had early on taken a keen interest in architecture and urbanism around the world and admired the work, the design and dialogue of a diverse range of beings, including the pioneers, the Great Gang, and all the makers of modern things, and all very busy with the meaning and place of architecture in a period of history that at moments got close to the egalitarianism we were all expecting. It became clear that in our midst Muni was looking at these things from another perspective and in the context and learning of his own culture's manifestations in art and architecture. His take on things and direction of view came from another and equally absorbing domain, chiming well with his caring, open and understanding spirit, which made possible his many fruitful connections and long-lasting friendships. At making places and buildings, Muni Ganju was certainly a great protagonist and a brilliant architect. His serious and successful architectural studio produced an impressive range of work from the small scale houses through to major urban and rural renewal with master plans at the large scale. The oeuvre includes the neighborhood housing quarter in Delhi for the Press Association, the temple court at the MacLeod Ganj for His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and many other excellent buildings and projects too numerous to go into here. The wonderful Dolmaling nunnery at Dharmshala is perhaps his most seminal work, a great and very alive place with a network of cloisters, arcades and courts, with a meeting place at the center, extensive gardens for produce and pleasure, and a large tented debating space for the nuns. Pondering the unique character, way of being and living of the person, it seems to me Muni, while interested in both the secular and the non-secular, with the dichotomy this implied, was certainly curious and keen on adventure and learning, which always had something good. Yet he clearly remained true to his beginnings and early upbringing. He didn't become a European or lean towards such, and just enjoyed a huge range of friends everywhere, and in doing so he learned about, appreciated and absorbed their respective cultures and history. In pursuit of his philosophy, he planned a whole series of houses with gardens, including building his own house and studio on the urban south fringe of the city in the neighborhood of Ayanagar. All the while he was proposing improving basic design standards for renovation, including the installation of good sanitation and paving the streetscapes of a whole section of the city. Today, Ayanagar demonstrates by example the principle of healthy and dignified urban renewal by citizens. Muni was a great person and a very good and most intelligent architect. He was a significant player and influential teacher in architecture, both in India and amongst his friends, colleagues and students across the planet. I can also say how utterly sad and lonely the world seems at this moment, knowing that Muni is no longer here. He was for so many of us such a solid and big part of life over a very long time. We were lucky to know him. His legacy is a powerful one and will endure.
I've been asked for my memories of Muni's time at the AA in London in the 1960s. So what I'm going to share with you are just a few snapshots. Muni appeared at the AA in 1961, dressed in a smart blazer, a crisp white shirt and tie, immaculately pressed trousers and highly polished shoes. Someone remarked on the elegance of his hand-stitched clothes, and he explained they aren't really elegant, just very tight. Perhaps his school in India had been set up on British lines under the Raj. He immediately fits in. Perhaps it's his charm, or his beauty, which at the time we were of course too young ourselves to have noticed. He's been assigned to second year and goes to live in a terrace house with other second year students. He has the room by the front door overlooking the street. I don't really remember how we became friends, but when I moved into that house and got to know him, he told me that at his college in India, he'd always chosen the room by the stairs, and he'd keep his door open all the time so as to talk to anyone who went by. Anyway, we bought the same smelly paraffin stoves to keep warm in the dreadful winter of 1963. And in the summer, we bought the same cotton suits from Carnaby Street, and we went to France, and we broke our way into Corbusier's derelict Villa Savoie. And we grappled with the same succession of design projects. The AA, like every other architecture school, based its teaching on project work, and its particular strength was that there was no prescribed solution. The brief was to be questioned mercilessly, and it was implicit that tutors didn't know the answers, which might not even be of building. They were there to help us to think, and the students largely learned from each other and by absorbing architectural ideas that were floating about in London. It was all very exciting. The AA in the 1940s had been political, communist. By the early 1960s, architecture was being conceived as a science, and we had brilliant and inspiring lectures on duct sizing. The final project in third year was a public library. Muni wanted to design a building which could change in the course of its life. He proposed a notional three-dimensional grid governing the concrete precast elements that could be bolted together in different configurations as new needs emerged. I told him there should be some spatial clue at the entrance to his building, suggesting where to go next. But he said you could put up a notice. He didn't tell me at the time, but the previous summer he'd been co-opted as a draftsman on a research project that resulted in Northwick Park Hospital. And John Weeks, the lead architect, would later publish his ideas on flexibility and indeterminacy in buildings. Hospitals were not to be architectural monuments. They were therapeutic instruments. In 1964, I moved into a house with Heywood and Jenny Hill, who will be speaking later. Muni painted the floor of his room white. He fixed a rail to the white ceiling, and all round the perimeter of the room hung a white curtain, entirely hiding the white walls. There was a mattress on the floor, and anything else was stored behind the curtain. For the final diploma in fifth year, Muni and I worked together on a joint project about housing. Our tutors were from the Archigram group, and they allowed us to do exactly what we liked. There was an abiding interest in grids, especially triangular grids. And as Muni speculated, I would ask, what in concrete terms did he mean? And he made diagrams on file cards with strips of sticky paper. And we filmed the Dodgem cars in Battersea Funfair, and then we spliced it all together with impressive captions. For some reason, the final crit of our opaque and enigmatic project aroused a lot of curiosity. The big lecture room in the basement of the AA was packed out. When Buckminster Fuller visited the AA a few months later, we were presented to him in the director's office. He sat through our interminable slides and then broke in, okay, I get the picture. Muni gave me a copy of the Gita and went back to India. He became interested in tantric art. But after 2 or 3 years, now married to Nimma, he returned to London. He gave his friends prints of the mandala he had drawn, coloured with blue and yellow crayon. He found work with Norman Foster, for whom he designed and detailed a steel bridge between 2 buildings. And years later, when he was supervising the building of the stone canopy for the Tibetan Buddha in New Delhi, he particularly wanted to show me the small chisels, which were the only tool the masons needed to dress all the stone. I'd been to New Delhi the first time in 1982, and he'd shown me the press enclave and his favourite Hindu places and the Mughal tombs. And he also took me to visit his family guru, who'd helped him decide whether to withdraw from the world as a sadhu or to marry and embrace the world. The guru had a tiny ashram, a few small rooms around a court, almost completely filled by a temple housing the god. Muni closeted himself with the guru, who in any case didn't speak any English. But early the next morning, I went out into the abandoned scrubland around the ashram. A man suddenly appeared out of the bush and accosted me. I tried to explain I was staying with the guru. The man looked at me closely and said, "You can't just wander about, you know." When I see a picture of Lord Krishna with his bright blue body, I'm reminded of Muni. Would he be the driver of Arjuna's chariot, who would advise but not fight? Or was he the Krishna who entranced the gopis without them understanding who he really was?
Hello, my name is Heywood.
Hello, and I am Jenny.
We live in Wales, UK.
As students, except I was a young mother, we all lived in the same house in London. Muni, as he taught us to call him, painted his room completely white. For me, he was always a quiet, significant presence, listening, observing, and smiling often.
After college, he went back to India, but he returned later with his wife Nimma, and we loved her too. Since those days, we've kept in touch. They came to visit us here in Wales, usually in March, wearing thin Indian clothing, having to walk in the Welsh mud in light slipper-like shoes.
They brought us beautiful presents from India, fine shawls and scarves for me.
And brought early days Fab India shirts for me. Both Muni and I built houses for ourselves and our families, and we both had 3 children.
Muni and Nimma always loved and took a keen interest in our children, who loved their visits.
For us, going to India was a great adventure. We met Tara, Chandini and Surya, saw amazing places and ate delicious food. They were wonderful guides and generous with their time and the trouble they took.
Muni sometimes combined the journeys he arranged for us with a work project of his, which meant we had a deeper contact with India that as mere tourists would not have been possible. He took each of us separately to Dharmshala. I remember sitting on a mat on the platform of a Delhi station with him, waiting quietly for the overnight train, drinking sweet tea from little clay cups.
Like he'd done with Jenny before, Muni took me to see his wonderful Dolmalin nunnery building near Dharamsala.
In fact, he and I had stayed there in the guest accommodation.
Muni was never seduced by fashionable architectural styles. He had his own approach based on historic patterns and crafts of India, which he combined with a wise understanding of the needs of modern life. His method was to apply a fierce reasoning, but without ego. Hence his buildings have a warmth and a logical simplicity.
One aspect of Indian life, and an important one that he introduced us to, was his connection with spiritual practice and his duties towards at least 2 ashrams which we visited. One at Sonar he had designed, and in it housed his aunt, who was the guru. At another, associated I think with Nima's family, we were cooked to lunch by the temple guardian, then all 4 of us put into a room filled with an enormous cushion, wall to wall, on which we rested.
On another occasion, I was with Muni in a taxi. We stopped at a small wayside temple and got out. The temple was crowded with devotees sitting on the floor. Muni stepped through them with care and purpose towards the shrine. He rang a bell and disappeared through a small door into the Holy of Holies.
One final memory. 8 of us friends were on a train expecting Muni and Nima to join us at a station further down the line. We were greatly relieved when they appeared in our carriage, both glorious and beaming in yellow kurta and salwar kameez.
Muni was indeed a dear friend,
Yes, he was.
and our best love to Nima and the
Yes.
girls.
Muni had just finished at the Architectural Association and returned to India when I met him in Delhi. It was somehow inevitable that we would meet because there were so few Indians who were in the AA or had been to the AA, and he was in Delhi and I was in my 3rd year when I first met him. Soon after we met, he showed me his film, which he had submitted as a thesis for his final year. His tutor was Peter Cook, and it was very unusual because for a final year student not to prepare a design thesis but to submit a film was unheard of, and yet Peter supported him and got him to submit it successfully as a final year thesis. And that was the film that I sat in his house in Defence Colony and saw. It was very much like Muni, full of ideas, completely unconventional, and open-ended, not resolving any questions, but asking many questions. This wider engagement with Greer, I think, was a consequence of him, in his latter part of his life, becoming very clear about his notions of architecture and ideas. I think if I take the younger Muni, I find a man like any of us are, full of multiple ideas on multiple fronts. And as he grew older, some of these ideas were cast aside, and others he became more and more sure of. And in a sense, I feel that his engagement with the DVP school, as I interpreted, was almost a consolidation of what he considered to be the relevant ideas that he would need to take forward. And his engagement with the Greer too, and Vizayanagar, these almost separate hubs in which he was initiating activities in society. Not his Buddhist part may have demanded from him some kind of meditative practice, some kind of disengagement with the community, but it was parallel with his engagement with Greer and Ayanagar, that he was also engaged in the wider community with his ideas of how he can actually transform the environment. His later engagements with Greer, I think, was in a sense his engagement with a very wide young community of architects.
His contribution in education is actually phenomenal. You know, and I've known him since '74, and the way he was engrossed in teaching, and one of his qualities was to really, something that was gnawing him from within, he would not leave that until he found, the other end. And there was no end, of course. So he continued his investigation very seriously. He was a very serious-minded person. And that's how his study of Buddhism, his study of his own religion, which he was very familiar with, make a very important contribution to Ashish's personality, and his work in Buddha Jayanti Park and his contribution to TVB school is something that was really, he gave everything to.
His early work, actually, when he came back from England, one of the great monumental buildings that he's made was Press Enclave. I was fortunate enough to have lived in Press Enclave for a major part of my life. And when I met Ashish, accidentally I told him, look, I spent about 10 years of my life in Press Enclave. He said, really? And then we got to discuss what went into the making of Press Enclave. And I must say that while we were staying in Press Enclave, I would see waves of students come looking and studying what Press Enclave was, how it was made, its arrangement of structures, its architectural form. And really, to have lived in Press Enclave was the best part of my life so far. Very convivial, very open spaces, winds were flowing across, there was enough light inside the house. The compactness of the construction was really, gave the warmth. And once I knew Ashish was the man who made it, it gave me a better appreciation of what Press Enclave was.
Yeah, if you look at the housing in Delhi at that time, up to then, it's a sheer dumb modernism in many cases. Not all, but in many cases, which looks at quantitative and technological aspects more than human aspects. And as a student, what struck one when one studied the Press Enclave was the absolute freedom with which the notion of standardization, variations, the notion of order, and the freedom from order when required, all of these were so carefully studied that it is something which is absolutely rigorous and yet completely alive. And this, I think, you can see in all his early works, including the social center for a rural area that he did, which was a square plan, but so carefully proportioned and so carefully constructed that together it became a body which made meaning. And I think this is something in his work. In every work that I have seen, there is the sense of bringing together both materials and human life into a sort of vibrant reality.
This is Vinod Gupta. I met Muni in 1974 and we decided to work together. His press enclave housing, group housing project was under construction at that time, and I had started teaching at SPA Delhi. I was also interested in mass housing myself. We worked on a few competitions, Hudco housing competition and Manila housing competition. He saw housing as patterns of form and space, and I looked upon it as underlying ecological systems. Young Eyvk Menon was part of our team also. He also completed one building project, Center for Policy Research Office building for Kanvindyan Rai, and our partnership ended in 1983. Muni had this great ability to get after people in the government and to cajole them to deliver what was due under the rules. Muni also had the great ability to deal with people from many different backgrounds, and he was completely at home in the presence of celebrities. He could discuss just about anything under the sun and would always look at the larger picture and disliked intensely a reductionist approach taken by many specialists. He lived outside the normal rules of life. He would go to the press enclave for a site visit on his Luna, a tiny scooter, sit across the table and discuss with the contractor who came on his BMW. When he started the TVB School of Habitat Studies, he would work from an illegal building. When he found a permanent home for himself, it was in an unauthorized colony without municipal services. Indeed, in each of these situations, he believed he could get the government or municipal authorities to act. My understanding of the teaching program at TVB School, I taught only a short course there, was that building outside the established norms was important for the city and for the architectural profession as well. He believed that the profession of architecture needed to engage with society at large, and I think the series of talks he organized at India Habitat Center were an important contribution to the profession. Muni lived an alternate life quite unlike any other architect I know. His is a life to be celebrated as full of achievements. He was aware that the end of his journey was near. He had only a couple of years left. I will miss him.
I had known Ashish as an academic who had a great interest in theoretical aspects of architecture and urbanism. My personal interaction with him began when I was curator for the Festival of India in Paris. I requested Ashish to help me regarding the typology of a part of Srinagar with reference to the lake and boats. It was very interesting the way the houses and the urban scale of that part of Srinagar was interwoven with the boats on the lake. We went together to Srinagar to study it, and then I asked Ashish to take over to make measure drawings with a group of students and architects, and he took up this work with great enthusiasm, and probably for the first time there was actually a measured typology of Srinagar. Ashish contributed an article on the survey, and I believe it is a thoughtful contribution to the study of the wooden architecture and its implications on the scale and character of Srinagar. He had a philosophical bent of mind, which was often combined with pragmatic observations. Much later, when I was the chairman of the Delhi Urban Arts Commission, I requested him often as an advisor for his serious inputs into the urban scale studies which we were carrying out. He had contributed a paper on Ayanagar, where he was living, and his report and the study of the area is an important contribution on haphazard development which has taken place in Delhi and may be seen elsewhere in the country. Personally, I have lost a friend, and I think the country has lost a major thinking architect with a philosophical bent of mind.
It is very difficult for me to speak about Ashish. There was a time when my involvement with him was very deep and sometimes messy. I knew him as an architect, as the founding director of TVB, where I started my career as a teacher, as a partner in an architectural firm, and as a relative. My association with Ashish goes back to the early 1980s. I first met with him when I rented a couple of rooms from his mother, and that got me quite heavily involved with him and his family on a personal basis. Very soon, I was making drawings for him occasionally, which got me even more involved with him professionally as well. This association finally led to a partnership architectural practice for about 10 years. I can speak quite authoritatively about his architectural achievements, but that is not what I want to do. I'll leave that to others. It's about the man I want to speak about. What I admire most about him was his beliefs and the tenacity with which he held on to them and how he evolved them. He had his fears and his disappointments and many of what he considered betrayals. He had his despairs in full measure. He acknowledged them freely, confronted them, and came to some sort of acceptance with them. However, these never made him waver from his high standards of ethics and his core beliefs. He held on to them tightly and sometimes against great odds. He wore his heart on his sleeve and never was afraid to speak his mind, even if it was hurtful to others, which he would invariably balance with his compassion. He was indeed a very, very complex man. To me, he was the quintessential Kashmiri Shaivite Brahmin. He was religious without any fanfare. He regularly contributed his time to help various ashrams. To me, he represented the best of the tradition of tolerance and universality. He's one of the most broad-minded persons that I have known. He believed in mankind, and there was no place for narrow sectarianism in his heart. He was the universal man. I remember a talk I overheard many years ago that he was having with someone sitting in his office in Defense Colony in those days. I can't exactly remember what was being discussed, but there was this sudden, emphatically spoken words from him that he had been preparing for a long time for his eventual death. And when it finally came to him, it would have found him the most prepared by all his actions during his lifetime. He and I are two different people. There were times we clicked and there were times we disagreed. But I must acknowledge that I have been in large part shaped by him. I shall grieve his passing for a very long time.
I got closer was in 2010-11 when we sat together and we decided to discuss what we thought of architecture. And then we had a peer review. We had meetings over one whole year when we used to meet every month for 2 or 3 days, either in Delhi or in Pune. And we discussed many things. They were all recorded for somebody who wants to look at it. But this was a discussion that wandered into spirituality, into religion, and their connection to architecture. Because we kept saying that we are trying to clear ground and trying to clear a sort of theoretical base, which architecture seemed to be lacking. And whether it was possible to not philosophize and bring every part of your thinking to the process of construction and architecture. So this was a very major concern for us. And that reflects also later in our engagement with building beauty studies based on Christopher Alexander's thinking, which was very much the part of our discovery of architecture beginning.
When Ashish talked about the TVBA school, he had many stories to tell of the rise and fall of the TVBA school. And there was a sense of learning that came across when he described the rise and fall of TVBA school. And what I learned from that was that he had first-hand experience of what the education system in India really was, right? Specifically what the pedagogy in architecture was. And that was the ground where he really understood and formulated his ideas that education ought to be a joyful experience, contrary to what education has become at the time when he was running the TVBA school. So his idea of a new pedagogy was not only meant for architects, but he was equally concerned that schools and colleges and universities must also rethink of how education can become a source of joy and pleasure and learning, and not really where you are hegemonized or where you are tortured into doing what you don't want to do. So I think the TVBS and his making of the Buddha statue have some kind of a correspondence with each other. You see, when he described the making of the Buddha statue in the Buddha Jayanti Park, he was absolutely passionate about talking about how the prana pratishtha, the manner in which you give life to a creative work, is so essential not only to any art, but also to any education system. And I think these are wonderful ideas that keep nourishing us all the time.
You know, I was a young teacher when TVB started. And it was a very interesting series of exchanges that we had with Ashish. On one side, Varki and me; on the other side, Ashish and Ashok Lal and Eyvk Menon. And they did, in a way, what they did was they turned upside down our method. That we used to start from the elements, like when you do in Indian classical music, you learn how your notes first, then you learn and you go step by step like that. That was our method. But they said, no. First you have to know the city, or you have to know whole world, then the city, then like that. And it was a very interesting counterpoint. And these two systems were talking to each other continuously for many years while Ashish was there. And it was something which was, they would come to our reviews and we would be in their reviews. And together there was a new form of thought emerging over the period of 10 years or so, that these two schools were in connection. And in that sense, I think his contribution at TVB is to connect it to something which is large, something which is holistic, and not get tied down in the nitty-gritties straight away. And I think that is something that he continuously used to do in every studio that I have talked with him, that he would start from the whole and only later come to the details.
Well, when we got the news of Ashish's succumbing to COVID, I think we all realized that for so many of us whose lives he's touched and with whom he had worked, and others who had worked with him, a part of them has also left. And Ashish was a very special person. He had very deep and firm convictions. And also he was very persistent and and devoted to whatever his beliefs were. And he believed in a constancy of pursuit. In whichever way it is possible, in whatever way you can do it, you must keep at it. You should never let an idea or a belief fall by the wayside. You must persist with it. Something that he practiced all his life. And I think for many of us, that is an important lesson, and I think it has helped us find our or develop our own journeys. For Ashish also, the idea of any project was something that was long term. It is something that would continue over a long period. It would be a process. It would never be something that had to be done and dusted, completed and finished. It had to be something that would have some lasting presence, a lasting involvement, and would continue for a long time. It would also always be a project that involved people. It was a project that concerned people at large and always involved people with whom he could share the idea and with whom he can make some arrangements to allow the idea to carry forward. That was his notion of a project. Again, he had many projects. TV School of Habitat Studies was one of the more powerful ones. My association goes back to 1980, I think, when Kirti Shah had come around and he was setting up conferences in different cities, the big metropolitan centers of India, to think about the plight of people in the slums and people who do not get a fair share in the city or were marginalized in the city. And he had also wanted to do one in Delhi, and Ashish was the person who would lead the organization in Delhi. And I happened at that time to be invited to join it, which I did willingly. And that was really, in a way, a pathfinder for me personally. We prepared a number of audio-visual presentations which portrayed the plight of people in the cities and also those who were resettled during the emergency by Mr. Jagmohan at that time, rather brutally. And of course, Mr. Jagmohan happened to be the Lieutenant Governor of Delhi at that time, and he was invited to actually chair the conference. And when he discovered that this is what it is about and this is how things are being portrayed, he got very upset. But again, it was Ashish and Kirti who went and talked with him and managed to convince him that eventually the purpose of this whole thing is a positive one. It is not about criticizing only or finding fault. It is really a positive purpose. And so that was really it was the beginning of a long journey, because we started with that conference and that led to a bunch of people coming together, including some NGOs and people who are not exactly architects or planners, but other people engaged in various kinds of activities in civil society, to come together to form Griha. And Griha would be an organization, a kind of an informal organization, which would carry this mantle of looking at the stress of the city and the disadvantaged of the city, and general notions of what would be an appropriate approach to the making of the built environment in India. This would be something that Griha would carry forward. And then when the great triumvirate of Dr. K.L. Nadir, political scientist, Pogi Menon, and Ashish, when they came together, they could see that they can produce something, and they had the idea of writing a curriculum for a barefoot architect course. And this was promoted at that time by Mr. S.K. Sharma, and there was a small conference where Laurie Baker had also come and given some very good advice. And that was the beginning of the idea that there could be a new kind of teaching institution about the built environment, which produced people who were tied to the ground, tied to the local culture, and drew their inspiration from local cultures. And they would be in service of society rather than in service of a professional image or some sort of a competition of professional performances. You know, that was something that was putting all of us off, and we wanted it to be much more authentic than that. And eventually that led to the establishment of the TVB School of Habitat Studies. And I really do think this was a significant departure from the old notions of the schools of architecture and architectural education. Many things were thought through fundamentally. And I think for all those 10 years or so, or more than a decade, that the school managed to work independently before it had to be absorbed into the Guru Gobind Singh Indraprastha University. At the beginning with Ashish at the helm, and then after he left we carried on with the same mission. I think that was a journey which brought together so many people, not only the students but many faculty, along this stream of thought, and has impacted, I think, many lives, and given them some meaningful direction. And I think the credit for all of this goes to that belief, that fundamental value that Ashish carried, which is, I think, something that we all shared at the end of the day. Ashish had many projects. When he moved on to Ayanagar, the urban village on the outskirts of Delhi, and built himself a house there, he committed himself to the local community and decided that he should work with them, and built up an organization. And that brought Griha back into operation. That was one project that, several governments, several administrations, the local communities, their hierarchies and divisions, but he patiently worked at it, one step at a time, to gradually find ways of improving the infrastructure of that village, slowly building trust. Very much an Ashish capability. Stay with it and keep at it. Other projects were, if TVB School of Habitat Studies, from which he moved out, was not his completed dream, he had a project in mind which he considered to be the School of Design, and that was something that he continued to work on till the very end, when he gets involved, again invited by the Center set up by the followers of Christopher Alexander, again to rethink the whole notion of design, and design as a general discipline, and as well design as a discipline for the built environment. That was one project. Other projects, of course, apart from Ayanagar, was a project in itself. There was the project of a museum of architecture. I suspect the beginning of that project came when Ashish was asked to help by Charles Correa to set up the first exhibition on Indian architecture that he organized. I forget what it was called. That came out as a book, I think. But he kind of put that together for Charles. He contributed a great deal to that. And I think somehow through that, the notion grew that there needs to be a museum of architecture that celebrated authentic architecture, not performance architecture, authentic architecture. And that was a project that he kept at, shared with many people, and tried to give it form, and it still remains an incomplete project. And there's a School of Design was another one. So there we are. I think he's shown us the way. Me personally, I think he was very influential in giving a direction to my own life work through the engagement and working with him in the early days and through the experience of TVB School of Habitat Studies. A very special person who would be really missed and really remembered.
My association with almost exactly 28 years ago, when in the summer of 1993, I entered the TVB School of Habitat Studies, the new school of architecture founded in 1990, where Muni was the founding director. He was also the studio head for the first 2 semesters. This was a new world where learning was fun and every day was a new experience. However, being in need of guidance, I figured out that I needed a mentor and no better one than Mr. Ganju. I started following and listening him more and more in an intent manner. My association became closer when I interned with him in the summer holidays of the second year and started getting a grasp of the profession and the wide reach of architecture and also the persona behind the person. Here I learned the process, attention to detail, and how to convert thought into drawings so that it could be built by others. I also came to know about Grehal, an association started in 1974, which included the founders of the TVB School of Habitat Studies, Dr. Nadir, Mr. Menon, and Ashok Lal. The new School of Architecture was a result of a vision document set out in 1974, where he questioned the way the profession was practiced and how it was taught. Mr. Ganju never let go of the idea to bring change, usually in a revolutionary way. In a few years, the TVB School of Habitat Studies had built a reputation with a difference. Behind every action was a thought, keeping the environment and community in mind. Its name reached far and wide, including internationally through his personal and formal academic links with MIT, Oxford Brookes, and the University of East London. Thinkers, artists, and educators visiting the school on a regular basis. Progressively, he also became my mentor, and accordingly, I took him as my dissertation guide, and later my design master in the final years. While doing my thesis and after graduation, I assisted him in several design and research projects while establishing my own practice independently. On his encouragement, I also started teaching along with him at the TVB School. He had transformed from being my mentor to being my guru, while transforming me to become a thinking professional and an educator. To dream and think ahead while keeping my feet on the ground and being aware of the community that surrounds us. Over the last 2.5 decades, I had the privilege and good fortune to converse and meet with him regularly, sometimes several times a month, while working on diverse initiatives and projects ranging from the detailing of his studio, master planning for campuses, conservation of heritage districts, and creating a series of community outreach activities or framing the structure of a future National Museum of Architecture. Over the last decade or so, he focused his energies on working for the underprivileged and community around him. He wanted to make a difference in their daily lives by providing an ecological method for sanitation, which could be maintained easily. He called this urban renewal for citizens and by the citizens. Over the last few years, he also started defining a new curriculum for architectural education, an idea that germinated after the closure of the TVB School of Habitat Studies, and associated himself with Building Beauty, a new teachings of Christopher Alexander. He once again associated me to teach and think alongside with him. For me, all these initiatives and projects were a means to keep interacting and learning from him on all aspects of architecture and life. He has stated several times that architecture was a grandmother. Nothing could shake his belief that good architects were the primary means to improve the lives and communities in which we live. Personally, I get professional growth from Muni. I will definitely miss him, and knowing that the void cannot be filled. I hope to follow the path set forth by him in the days and years to come. Thank you.
How does one describe a human association which was so rich in a few words? Professor Ganju was not merely a colleague, but an elder and a very deeply affectionate person for us. My association with him became very intense after, I think, 2014, when we actually got out of SEPT, and his concern for what I was doing at SEPT and the kind of treatment we got at that time made him extremely disturbed. And, we started communicating very closely ever since. It was also the same time when the idea about working on history of architecture in India was very predominant in his mind. And as an activity of Griha, he wanted to really work on this subject with a like-minded people group, which was formed by him, around him. And it was the first conference in Bhopal that he organized with the sponsorship of School of Planning and Architecture in Bhopal. And this conference actually brought all of us together to work on this, important subject. Ever since, I think, my association with him became very close. It was also partly because I was also visiting Delhi very often. And every time I visited Delhi, it was on my agenda to somehow either talk to him on telephone or, if the time permitted, visit him in his Ayanagar house, or he was extremely kind enough to come down to IIC in Delhi, at least for a dinner with me. And these meetings were very often. And now that I look back, these have become my cherished memory. Every time we met, I think we spent at least 3-4 hours together, discussing things, which were of our common interest. And, trying to, sort of work out strategies to really, address especially to the needs of education and architecture. Because from the beginning, I think he was quite deeply interested in architectural education. And his association, along with other colleagues at TVB, was something, which was a kind of, commitment that proved, his deep, love for academics in architecture and the need to direct the academics in architecture to our own, sort of needs of looking at our architecture from our own lenses, So this was something, which has always been a very enriching experience for me. It is very difficult to think today that he's no more with us. In fact, it is very difficult to even imagine that, because, my association with him became even stronger when he started visiting Ahmedabad as a kind of advisor to the master's program here at the Anand University. Because every time he came, he spent a few days here. And after his university work was over, he used to always come home and sit with us for 2-3 hours, even had meals with us. So it became a very, very affectionate and close relationship in these last years. It was very good for me to take part in a webinar just 2 months ago, which was organized by Jamia Millia. And Savyasaachi was very kind enough to somehow get me the information to attend that as an attendee. So that was the last time I think I saw him talking about, architecture and education in that webinar. Following that, I think we lost touch, because I think due to pandemic, everything was somehow getting disjointed. And I had no chance to somehow even know, unless I came to know from Narendra Dengle that he was not keeping well. And so the anxieties were building up. And I used to my only source was to check with Narendra Dengle and find out about his health. But I think the inevitable was to happen. And that really happened. And, Professor Ganju was taken away from us. But I do believe that Greha and the group will continue his work, and we all will commit this to at least bring it to some kind of completion as far as our history book is concerned. Because this history book will be something, which is a product of his ideas, a product of his commitment, and I think it will be a befitting kind of tribute to a man, who was so affectionate and who loved his work and who dedicated his life for this. So there would be nothing, appropriate for us as a group to really complete this to his, imaginations and, make this as our tribute to him. Ashish Ganju will always be with us.
Ashish Ganju taught me to read a city like Delhi in about 3 weeks flat. My tool was camera, and project was to follow migrants and trace their steps towards becoming citizens. This inquiry was to conclude in an exhibition, and this was my first encounter with him. Every day I would bring my images to his studio and lay it out on a circular table where Ashish and other experts were waiting. And we would all huddle together to closely look at the day's work. That reading would forge connections between images and generate new meanings which didn't exist when I shot them. Frame by frame, Ashish guided me to understand the truth about the body of an Indian city and how migrants actually make the spine of that body. In those few days, I had picked up a new vocabulary to direct my camera. Each frame had become an opportunity to visualize and dignify this amazing story of migrants searching their dreams in a city. Ashish had transformed me. Now the city looked more like a familiar book that I could read, with a story that revealed its functioning. This exposure, 42 years ago, gave me an ability and a lifelong passion to read any city that I'm in. When we bought land in Ayanagar, Ashish emerged as a key member of our group of 20. After the deal was finalized, he helped us with plotting our individual holdings. He also got us to form a community with a green charter. He named it Eco Options. Looking back,
It was a visionary name for a community that continues to be experimental and a work in progress. We all had minimal amount of money, but maximum amount of ideas. This ensured that our houses would look frugal, but not necessarily poor. How could this frugality become an expression of certain wealth, certain richness? Could beauty become the other face of frugality? Yes, and Ashish showed that by building an elegant jewel of a home for his family. He demonstrated that by using appropriate materials and inventive techniques, you could let the form discover its own emergence, rather than stamp it with a predetermined style. Simple but attractive, his house was scaled in a manner that you could nearly hug it. Details were well thought out: doors, windows, floors, and a garden with plants nurtured lovingly by his wife Nima. But he started with a garden. Design of a sewage system was always the foundational idea for him. He managed to process the flow of sewage through plants in a way that he got a functioning garden on one hand and the odorless, smooth sewage system on the other hand. Later on, he was to expand this idea for whole of Vayanagar. Ashish was a profound conversationalist. Any talk with him would start as a drop and then move on to become an ocean. This constant awareness of the whole marked him out as a remarkable guru who managed to be here and now, and also be there simultaneously. These conversational journeys would always lead to new meaning making, new insights, and new transformations. Like when drop became an ocean, and ocean became aware of its own origin in that drop. Teaching is what came naturally to Ashish. He could spend hours in discussions, arguments, and putting together yet new possible scenarios for better design education. But the scale at which he made the biggest impact among students was in his one-on-one encounters with them, either as interns in his office or in studios of architectural schools. He acted like a master who would tune in tanpuras of his disciples, so to say, to play the ragas as these should be played for the ears of best connoisseurs. His spontaneous, easy laughter, his warm, loving eyes were a sure sign that the student had met the master in that some moment. In Ashish, I've personally lost my own wisdom tree, a tree whose roots seem to connect with every other wisdom tree in this world. To lose that is to lose one's own compass. Even as you become the ocean, dear Ashish, drops shall continue the conversation as rain. Thank you for your warmth, thank you for your love, and thank you for your friendship.
Yeah, this is KT Ravindran, and I'm really at a wrong end with the absence of Ashish. Even though we have not been regularly interacting for some time now, Ashish was always a kind of luminous presence. And he is certainly the conscience keeper of our profession. And in a kind of highly competitive and self-centered world, Ashish was really an oasis where his idealism and his professionalism stood out as examples for everyone to follow, both young and old. Ashish's public-mindedness is perhaps one of the rarer qualities that you find among professional architects. Now, his charisma had attracted so many young and old people alike, and many people rallied around him and depended on him to generate that intellectual environment where there is a stimulation available at any given time. Ashish was really an example of, a very rare kind of public-minded architect, and that I think is what qualifies him most in my view. Also, my association with him goes back to about 50 years or so, for mid-70s, maybe you can say 45 years. And we shared many platforms, both in terms of ideation as well as in terms of jury space. Very often we found ourselves in the same jury, or sometimes proposed each other's name for the juries, and then we would be actually able to work together so well during those jury sessions. And main thing is that we were driven by very similar values, and even though I was in a completely different field, Ashish steadfastly carried out his ideals with great perseverance. I think that's one great thing about Ashish, was that he pursued things to its end, and he made sure that whatever is begun is now taken to a point of fruition. Now, I think if the best tribute that we can pay to Ashish is now to actually assess the kind of initiatives which he had started, both in terms of ideation as well as institution building, and ensure that they are carried through fully, and perhaps for perpetuity create that kind of an institutional framework that can carry out Ashish's ideas without any break, because he may be physically absent, but he was a deeply spiritual person, and his idealism sprang partly from that highly evolved and very intense sense of spirituality which he was endowed with.
Let me begin by first telling you what the 4 sections of this essay are. The first section is self as community. The second section is the act of building with the awareness of an evolving universe. The third section is maintenance as renewal. And the fourth section is regeneration with learning. And we wanted to avoid going into too much of semantic complication. And also, since we were talking about theory, to me, theory is actually the pursuit of truth. There is always an underlying truth in anything we do, and theory has to find that truth. It's not to do with the scientific theory of experimental testing, verification, etc. only. That's one. I think that's part of the story. The real story is finding the truth of certain actions. So it has to be direct. If it's going to be the truth, then it must be very direct, easy to understand, and you must feel it as true. You cannot only argue it in your head or calculate it in your head. You must feel it as being actually true. So to find theory, one had to find the truth. And so we wanted it to be as direct as possible. We started with the self, which is where all our perceptual awareness begins. And then we had to do a building, an act. Action has to be performed, which leads to a consequence of something, an object or some assembly of objects being produced, and then which decays with time, hence it has to be renewed. And renewal makes you think about the whole process of life and death and continuity. And that leads to a regeneration with learning, because regeneration actually adds knowledge to what existed before. And it is that activity of adding knowledge to the existing store of knowledge which was very important, hence regeneration. Generations know what they have to, what they are doing. but the next generation actually has the potential to take it forward and to evolve to a higher state.
Namaste, everybody present and hearing me. Firstly, I would like to thank Narendra for giving me this opportunity to share my thoughts on our very dear friend that we are all missing today. And most importantly, I would like to share my thoughts with his wife, Nima, my dear friend, and also his children. Nima has been not just a friend, but she has been like a sister to me. So I want her to know that I think of her almost every day. And I want her to know that this happens to everybody, and we have to be just brave and face it. And the beauty behind it is, when you think about how he lived, I think this should give you more joy than anything else. I say this because during my experience of firstly having found him as an architect for my new project for the homeless nuns that came from Tibet, I found him not just as a famous architect, but I found him. I was interested in working with him because I thought he was a person with principle. And then as we worked together for more than 30 years, it became more and more evident that he was a man with vision, accompanied by ethics and principle. This today in this world is more important than ever before, because there are so few who are like that. So when I think of him, in fact, my husband also joins with me in sharing all these ideas and thoughts about him. Whenever we talk about him as a friend, we talk about him accompanied by all these values. So I would like to once again tell his dear wife, children, and all his friends that that is the friend that we had in Muni. And of course, he was very, very proud of what he did in Dharmshala, building this nunnery. And not only that, whoever comes and sees that finds it most unusually beautiful. And the reason why it's so beautiful is, again, his principle was accompanied by building something more concrete, comfortable, but trying to make it simple and cheap. So that's what we did, because in a way we couldn't afford to go so elaborate. But then in a way, because we did that, everybody who sees it today appreciates that so much. So we have nothing but all good things about him to remember and talk to anyone if we have to. And I would like the family to know that. And whether he's there or not, I'm very much a friend to the family, and I shall always remain your friend, and with a deep affection and respect for your dear husband and your father. And I would also like to share one thought with you, which is, when we were children, the elders used to tell me that live your life in such a way that when you die, everybody cries and you go smiling. So I think this is what we can apply to our dear Muni's life. So may he have a wonderful, peaceful journey and reach to a place where we are all hoping to reach.
Ashish was inspiring, meticulous, responsible, and infinitely caring. He demanded excellence, nothing less. And so it was that Dolmeling was conceived and became the perfect campus for our refugee nuns to heal and grow. In Ashish, we were blessed with the ultimate guide. He had to coax us to understand his values, but he always listened and worked to find the best possible way to provide for the needs and comfort of the nuns. I came to this venture knowing practically nothing about design or construction. Warmed by his idealism, I gratefully absorbed his courage and everything I needed to know to execute this scheme. Ashish was totally dependable and always answered my urgent calls for help. I was granted the ultimate learning experience of one-on-one on-site training with a teacher who spared no trouble to explain each and every point in painstaking detail, from first principles to each and every practical detail. Living next to Dalmaning now, I have the time to thoroughly appreciate Ashish's ultimate creation. Each building sits comfortably on the land, each spaced and connected by verandas and courtyards, tiers of slate roofs in tune with the rice terraces and hills behind. During this year of lockdown, a time of tension and fear, I'm constantly aware of how happy and relaxed our nuns are within this harmonious composition of light and space, nature, community, and comfort. We cannot choose when it is our time to leave this world. Sadly, we did not expect to lose Ashish so soon. Indeed, before we were finished with our work. When we go, we all hope that what we leave behind stands to serve our memory well. If ever anyone made a difference and leaves a powerful, lasting legacy, it is Ashish, in the buildings and ideals he bequeaths us. I will remember him fondly and with deep gratitude.
We lost a friend, last so many years, probably every alternate day and sometimes even every day we spoke, and the conversation would go on for an hour or so. It would break, as Sachi rightly said, it would break this way, that way. It would be reconnected in a way. And this happened even during the writing of Discovery. The ideas were shared at any odd time. And, at the same aspect of his character has been very, very warmly felt by the students who come from different countries. Teaching last whole year, we've been teaching students from different countries, and he's made such a big impact on them that they're very, emotionally involved. They're aware of his contribution. They remember his words, and they quote him. So it's a very wonderful thing to have. And I think we need to resolve that we continue some of his work at least in many directions that are present: Greha, discussion forums, education, and so on.
Ashish was a very good student, because my first meeting was with him in IIC when he wanted to discuss the Meroli project that he wanted to start off on. And ever since then, we've been talking, discussing until the very last. The fact that he was a good student made him connect with all disciplines, because he would want to learn from everybody who was wanting to say things. So the most memorable experience in this is really that we used to organize small group discussions. Sometimes we meet in IIC, sometimes we met at the Tushita Buddhist Center, sometimes in Ashish's home. And the effort really was, Ashish strongly believed the fact that as long as a group exists, the conversations will go on. Right? So the effort was to keep a collective life, to build a community of people who wish to share, even if there was no conclusion. And that was such a wonderful part of him as a person. And I think I'm quite grateful to him for having allowed me to say what I had to say, not knowing fully what architecture really was, and having introduced me to wonderful people like Neelkanth, Narendra, and many others in this profession. And I think that's partly because I learned from him more than anyone else what does it mean to be a good student, and a professional.
Savyasaachi, I think you have brought up a very important point, that the idea of dialogue as the basis of teaching, learning, the idea of ideas emerging out of a conversation between a number of people, all of whom may be different. This is something very not very common in architectural circles, because architects are trained to be individuals and they shy away from exposing themselves or making themselves vulnerable to a larger group. And what Ashish could do was to make himself vulnerable in a bigger group, often getting angry, and in his moments of anger, he was somebody to see really. But still passionately standing for an idea, and then I think bringing it together. And I think most of the conversations that I've enjoyed have been conversations in which all the people who were there were moving from one level of understanding to another level of understanding in their own ways, not by being told or not by accepting somebody's view, but through dialogue.
Water cycle management in an urban neighborhood, an experiment in environmental technology. The story of a pilot project for sewage and wastewater management undertaken for the Delhi government in the year 2017 and 18. The project uses a decentralized system of biodigesters for primary treatment of soil and wastewater installed below the roads. Secondary treatment is done by bioremediation in a reed bed and treated water recycled for use of the residents. The pilot project is the result of first-hand research conducted in Ayanagar, New Delhi between the years 1999 and 2017 by Griha, a charitable society for research on human habitat. The research was led by M.N.Ashish Ganju, currently president of Griha. Ayanagar is a 500 or 600 years old village on the outskirts of Delhi, bordering Gurgaon in Haryana. Since the 1980s, the village has been urbanizing, its population having doubled since 2000. Around this time, Griha established itself in Ayanagar and started to work with the local residents to understand and guide the development of the built environment. The village was extending in a proto-urban pattern without adequate infrastructure or social amenities. The most urgent requirement, agreed by all, was drainage, which included sewerage, wastewater, and surface drainage. Water supply to the village and its extensions was inadequate, the traditional system of rainwater harvesting and shallow wells having been neglected and degraded. Spontaneous house building activity without environmental design or planning was rampant in all open spaces. To design an effective drainage system in these conditions, it was evident that the centralized municipal system, which originated in Europe in the 19th century and early 20th century, was not appropriate. To convey sewage in underground pipes to treatment plants several kilometers away, a large amount of water was required, and this was just not available at present or in the foreseeable future. Hence, a decentralized model was required, which could provide primary treatment contiguous to the household. This became feasible by using technology developed by the Defence Research and Development Organization of the Government of India for biodigestion of soil waste in discrete containers which could be minimized in size. The new technology was adapted to create a small-scale plumbing system which could be installed below the roads, even if they were very narrow, without entering private houses. The treated effluent from the biodigesters would undergo secondary treatment through bioremediation in a constructed wetland in the nearest suitable open space available. Technical support was provided by the Center for Science and Environment, who shared their expertise in decentralized wastewater management. Ayanagar is located in the southwestern edge of Delhi. Z Block is a dense urban neighborhood of Ayanagar, housing about 300 families. The neighborhood is surveyed and accurately modeled to inform the residents about the scheme.
लोकल अथॉरिटी से पार्टनर करें यहाँ के रहने वाले और बीच में टेक्निकल एक्सपर्ट हैं जो को बता सके कि काम टेक्निकली ठीक कैसे होता है जो नेट वैल्यू नहीं कर रहे हैं No, it is representation also. No. I have not about it. It is all a consultant or and we don't know what is the time frame of the Sarpale project. If it is, you are making research is 9-10 years. So next 10 years we will be doing this project. So it's not no use to us. ट्रीटमेंट प्लान इसको बहुत समस्या जैसे आपने कहा पानी आ जाता है एक तो हमारा जो ब्लैक वाटर है एक क्लीन वाटर है एक बरसात का वाटर अभी आप ये कह रहे हैं कि आपकी पूरे सारे तरह के वाटरों की समस्या को सॉल्व करने की जिम्मेदारी तो आप पूरी हल कर देंगे.
The process of water cycle management starts with soil waste treated by biodigesters discharging to a grey water mains and secondary treatment by a reed bed before recycling. Biodigesters are installed under the roads. These are specially designed and fabricated using a patented system developed by the Defence Research and Development Organization of the Government of India. This technological innovation allows for a decentralized distribution of biodigesters with minimum water requirement for flushing. Septage is treated nearest source and treated effluent discharged to a grey water mains connected to a reed bed before recycling. The entire treatment system is accommodated under the narrow roads, maintaining a domestic scale. The roads are repaved to harvest rainwater along with the surface water. Concrete block paving completes the renewal of the streets. Joining Z Block is the village Johar, once the water source for the settlement and now the dump collecting solid and liquid waste of the surrounding mohallas. The reed bed is located along the boundary of the Johar with the secondary school. Plantation in the reed bed can be seen from the school classrooms and makes a colorful boundary to the Johar.
Well, I'm supposed to talk of Muni, which I'm glad to do, even though it is difficult. It is difficult for, well, a number of reasons, some of which I may grasp, many of which I can't. Well, one thing which makes it difficult is that it doesn't look like he's gone. I mean, it doesn't look at all. From my perspective, at least, it is very difficult to come to terms with the fact that he's not with us anymore. The way we got in touch is interesting. We did because Narendra and him sent a copy of The Discovery of Architecture, the delicious booklet they wrote together, to Chris Alexander, and it happened that I was at Chris's place with his wife Maggie when they talked about that, and then I remember Maggie standing up and going and getting the book out of the shelves and flipping the pages of it. And both Chris and Maggie talked about that with so much respect and so much delight, really, that of course I got immediately very curious about it, and I asked them to send me a copy, which they did immediately. And then I understood why. It is a beautiful piece of work and deliciously written, with a sort of both depth and lightness, which is a combination very rarely occurring, especially in theoretical works, which then I learned was a distinctive trait of Muni's personality, always so balanced, always so light and deep at the same time. This trait, which was so typical of him, has been of great, well, I learned a lot about it just by talking to him. So then we got in touch because, well, I proposed to Chris and Maggie. I said, well, let's get in touch with these guys because we need people like this. We were at the beginning of the Building Beauty adventure, and then that was the beginning. So Maggie asked me to get in touch with Muni and Narendra, which I did, and then, yeah, that was the beginning of many, many years of beautiful relationship, which touched the fundamentals of what count the most, I believe, in our professional life. And beyond that, it is pointless to make distinctions sometimes between what belongs to the profession and what belongs to life. So yeah, what can I say? I've got so many memories, and one in particular, maybe if I can, regards the house in which I was so nicely welcome in Delhi. The house that Muni and Nima built, which was and is an extraordinary house to me, because it is completely devoid of any burden, of any superstructure, and it is just what I mean. Using Chris's word, it is probably we could say it is just right. Chris used to say that, just right, nothing more, nothing less. It's such a difficult thing to achieve, especially when you are an architect. To get it just right, to get rid of all the thoughts and theories and keywords and buzzwords, and that 80, 90, maybe 100 years of academic thinking and academic game have piled up in our minds and in our hearts. It is incredibly difficult for everybody to get to the point, but if you are an architect, it is even more difficult, because you have not only to tame your own superficial, very often, dreams and visions as a normal human being, but you also have to get rid of the architectural ones which are fit into your brain very often by your architecture education. And what it takes to go through it, absorb it, become like it, and then it takes even more time to get rid of that all. And I remember that when I watched and lived in his house for a few days years ago in Delhi, I really understood what it takes to do that. And I really understood, but just by looking at Muni and him, I have to say, in that house, well, I understood the freedom. The freedom. Only on the ground of which you can actually get to that point. It takes work, discipline, and commitment, and clarity of vision, and availability to actually reconsider and reconsider and reconsider again. And rarely in my life I've seen a person who has been, let's put it simple, good enough to himself and to his work and to the people around him or her to actually do that. So, well, I will stop it here, and I'm gonna miss him.
I don't remember when I met Ashish ji, but I do remember the introduction of his work to us in 1979 when we were doing housing at Delhi School of Planning and Architecture Design Studio. Later on, I came to know more about him when he set up the TVB School of Architecture with Professor A.G.K. Menon and Professor A. B. Lall. And we are observing this school shaping differently, parallel to the SPA. I've known many students who have passed out from TVB, and the effort Professor Ganju put in there in nurturing the school could be seen in the product which was coming out of TVB. I was not very much connected with him when I was in Delhi. I shifted to Pune in 1990. He visited us in Jan 2007 where he spoke on at Feed, and that was the time onwards that one was connected much more with Ashish ji. He was a regular jury member at our school for thesis, and it was that time that one realized that how could he connect so well with the students, coming down to their own level and getting so involved with the thesis work. Every summer I've been taking students to Delhi for last 1 decade to explore contemporary architecture. One day was always dedicated to the housing demonstrations, the Yamuna apartment, the Tara apartment, and Press Enclave. The Press Enclave housing always was exciting to see in terms of its simplicity, clarity, and which was executed at such a low cost in the 1970s. I was the one who looked at habitat differently and in totality in terms of total sustainability. He in fact moved from Lajpat Nagar to Ayanagar, the village where he spent his life in last 2 decades, I think, and was always experimenting in terms of the true sustainable environment. The last he came to Pune was in Jan 2020 when we conducted a teachers training program in habitat and housing, which always was the connect between me and him. I also had the opportunity of interviewing or having a chat with him under the Council of Architecture Talk series this year during the lockdown in September, where he was talking about simple things like clean air and clean water. When asked about why did he come and settle down in India after having done an undergrad and the postgrad both in Europe, he very candidly said that Europe is doomed, and this he was talking about in 1960s, and the future lies in the East. And I think he was very, very connected to the East and particularly our own country. He was very much concerned about the current reality and the way architecture profession is shaping and about the current built environment. He was called by his friends Muni, and I think that is so true. As a Muni, he was a person who demonstrated the values he preached, whether it was in academics, built environment, practice, or professional ethics of the highest order. Sir, you will be missed by all of us, but your thoughts, values, and works will keep on inspiring generation of architects in decade to come. Thank you.
We have come together in these times of global turmoil and chaos to pay tribute to Munishwar Nath Ashish Ganju. A special thanks to Professor Narendra Dengle and his team for organizing this event. In my scribble that I have prepared as a tribute to Ashish, I want to explore in the next few minutes a dimension that connects his personal life with his work life. This is the first experience in my life that I have lost a friend, lost a friendship that was growing over the years from initial admiration and hero worship into fondness and love. I must confess, I still have not emotionally accepted this void, the emptiness that fills my heart, the voice that I will never hear again. This new reality without Ashish is a field of flowers without fragrance. I wish to express my gratitude to a man who inspired and encouraged me over the years to find my own voice. Way back in August 1987, after a stint of 20 years in Germany, I was carrying a dream to be once again a part of the Indian soil, to reconnect to its past, and on a naive mission to be active as a planner in the valley of Kashmir. I arrived with this dream at the doors of Ashish and Mark's studio in Delhi Defense Colony. It was not accidental that I was strongly drawn towards Ashish. He had this familiar fragrance, that of a known ancient civilization. His inner sacred life, sanctified by Kashmiri Shaivism, was his cosmos, the source of his knowledge and his wisdom, which he nourished with his very personal and unique daily yoga practice. Some of us would remember of the deities that he had put lovingly on his desk. These were representing the DNA of his cosmos. Each act that Ashish engaged in, be it dressing up in a ferran, a Kashmiri cloak, or watering the Mount Meru, a sculpture that represents the metaphysical and spiritual center of the universe, or a cover that he designed for his car, made of only bamboo and mesh fabric, a structure he was very proud of, as only very frugal means were deployed to build it all. This all echoed his beauty and his sacred devotion. His profound Weltanschauung, a perception of working from the heart, was to create value free of stardom, free of fashionable isms, and free of external stimuli. The many hats that he often would say he wore deepened his insight into making buildings and places, into teaching, or in recent years, serving local communities and working at the city level. With this perspective, he remained intransigent, an outsider, enlightened, and always enlightening, an untiring mystic on a noble path of creating harmony, peace, and beauty. As I'm speaking about him, I realize how much I miss Ashish.
For a long time, Professor Ganju was an elusive figure for me. I had heard much about him in my time at the TVB School of Habitat Studies as a young teacher, and first met him many years after the closure of the school. Some architects were discussing the idea of a museum of architecture that day, and at the helm of affairs was this dynamic, older man, wise with experience and a true visionary. What gripped me most that day was Ganju sir's ability to just be himself. Without mincing words, he would say what he thought was right. My interactions with him grew from then on, and through the conversations, I realized the other multiple dimensions of the built environment that architecture professionals can begin to explore in a nation constantly struggling with questions of habitation. He would say, we must first be a conscious citizen, willing to take responsibility of collective spaces, built or open, and then use our technical expertise as trained professionals to make them better. For me, Sir stood as a person always in integrity with himself, his thoughts, ideas, and words. I learned from him how architecture is much about life and living, a setting to be inhabited. We shared a common passion, teaching, helping young students make sense of the world around them. In one conversation, he told me how some students once asked him about the difference between engineering and architecture. His answer was clear. Engineers build buildings, while architects figure how people will inhabit them. Along with Dengle sir, he wrote The Discovery of Architecture and believed that the ideas encapsulated in it ought to be shared with the academic fraternity of architecture and beyond. Many of us benefited from the multiple events that rolled out across institutions, one such at SPA New Delhi, my current workplace. The intellectual journey to understand philosophical interconnections that linked architecture, history, and society had begun for me. Ganju sir, along with others, constantly urged us to be in search of indigenous knowledges and practices that in India, even today, are imbued with traditional wisdom and ancient values. From him, I learned rather unknowingly how to take these ideas into my classroom. There is no point of thinking up ideas if you're not courageous enough to take action on ground, he said to me once while we walked the streets of Mehrauli. Under his aegis, a small team of built environment professionals had come together to bring about ground-up transformation of public spaces in the historical settlement. With increasing awareness of legal and political complexity within the space of Mehrauli, we began meeting officers of government agencies. After one such meeting, I looked up to Sir and asked, "Sir, don't you think you said too much to them today, given the situation?" And he said, "Parul, I have nothing left to lose. I must say what I think is right. Some people impact you without you knowing how much of you they have transformed. Ganju sir has impacted me more than I can make out. I will miss him dearly, his gentle voice theorizing architecture and then going off into a world of other conversations. His passion for what to teach and how to teach in a way that creates thinking practitioners. And his relentless energy to continue to keep going and make the effort necessary to make the world a better place for all."
As I try pen down my thoughts and gratitudes for Professor Ganju, a story comes to my mind which I read in a book called Wisdom from the Wilderness. It is a story of the unique relationship between a Kahankar, or the one narrating, and Ahankar, the one receiving and making the sound of Ahan, that is, I am with you. This tradition, probably still very part of Adivasis, recognizes the significance of indigenous wisdom in sustaining human and humane societies that are communitarian, cooperative, and collaborative. This wisdom is far more advanced and stark opposite to the modern competitive societies that we are all trapped in. In the story, a Kahankar is very restless, completely unable to hold on to a new narrative that is running through him, and he is seeking an Ahankar to narrate his ideas to. On the other hand, there is a Ahankar, desperate, feeling empty, to hear a new narrative. The both protagonists start wandering, looking for each other. And when they do meet, Kahankar began relating his narratives, and Ahankar listens and mutters Ahan Ahan in response. They get transported to another world, and it's shared trance. Day turns into the night and night into the day. They forget time, place, and themselves, so engrossed in the wisdom that was both engaging and disengaging at the same time. In that exchange, they both lost their material bodies. Later, to figure whose bones belonged to whom, the village people announced, "Let's throw the bones in the water." The word is the vehicle of energy. And so while relating the narrative, the Kahankar would have passed his energy and Ahankar would have absorbed it. It is but natural that the transmitter of energy would have lost weight while the receiver must have gained. I believe Professor Ganju had this likenessness. He transmitted energy, and many like me have absorbed his energy. Professor Ganju was like soul meter for me. I started interacting with him in about 2014-15 when I was seeking a mentor in participatory design practices. As a development practitioner, I get to work with a lot of multilateral aid agencies and the government, and he would give me a sarcastic remark often with a huge smirk. "So are you selling your soul?" This smirk was good enough for me to always recall what is my larger mission. In our last few conversations, we spoke at length about faith. Professor Ganju was a man of faith. He, of course, shared many mystical stories, such of his birth, his interaction with the Dalai Lama, Buddhism, and the faith in the community and architecture for and developed by the community. He believed this faith was integral to Indian way of thought and work. The notion of time did not exist for him. His conversations, his work, his approach towards life was never limiting. Faith and the cyclical time would keep Professor Ganju in all of us.
There is a difference between knowing the path and walking the path. Ashish Ganju, who I will always fondly call Sir, to me was that ideal. That is what I learned, and that is what he meant to me. After 6 years of unremarkable education at the SPA and a year of losing focus, I have to thank my stars for finding the way to his studio. I remember walking into his absolutely indescribable studio at 10 a.m. on an April morning in 2005, a lost, confused, and rather directionless young architect, and being blown away by its utter beauty and simplicity. I remember sitting in the waiting chairs and marveling over it, and asking myself time and again, how does someone do this? And in that 30 minutes of waiting, I realized if I could learn this, I would be the architect I didn't even know I wanted to be till then. Before I even met the man in person, I had decided whatever he offered, I was taking the job. The 3 years that follows were my growing up years. From learning how to think up a building and draw it with directness of purpose and clarity, to reaching a point where on site I could stand and suggest a shift in a building position and get a, "You are the architect, you are at site, you know what you are doing, so shift it," on a phone call without picture checks or drawings. At his studio, I grew into my own. That mentorship and growth didn't end when I left to spread my wings. It only grew further. In my heart and mind, I appointed him my guru, my architectural father figure, and to repeat a word he would often use, considered myself his shagird or apprentice. Learning, watching, being there if needed, quietly imbibing invaluable life lessons, and growing and maturing with every new exchange. It was not always easy learning from a man who would loudly lament at times, "I cannot suffer fools." But it was life-changing and hugely rewarding. Every meeting was an opportunity to learn, to hear a story, to find a new direction to explore, whether it was on the Mehroli project, or meetings for Griha, or just a slideshow for a presentation at some talk somewhere. There was new learning every step of the way. In 16 years of knowing him, we may not have had as many conversations as I wished, but each conversation was an affirmation. His life, as his work, as his conversations and his architectural detail was so amazingly consistent, direct, honest, purposeful, and devoid of fuss. And in a world full of posturing and posers, once you overcome that initial brunt of that honesty, the essentiality was beautiful and invigorating. Addictive, actually, you could not get enough of. And those thoughts and ideas have found their way into my work, into my teaching, into my worldview, my life. Once in studio with him discussing Ayanagar and the studio, his choice for living there and working here, he quoted lines from Dylan's Absolutely Sweet Marie. But to live outside the law, you must be honest. And to paraphrase the next line, I know I'd say I would agree. I've always wished to take his vision further and share those beautiful ideas. And I hope in my own life and work I can deliver some fraction of that impact and goodness. 16 years was never going to be enough. No, I needed more. We all needed more. I was not ready. In truth, I would never be ready. But I will take courage from his courage and strength from his strength and carry forward his legacy and try to honor my Guru in the best way I can. Thank you for 16 years of unfinished conversations. May they continue to guide me on my way.
Professor Ganju came to our college as a juror at the end of our fourth year studio, and I wanted to work with him immediately after. So I did my internship with him. After completing my course, I worked with him as an architect for a little over another year. He wasn't one of those teachers who told you how the world works. He showed you how hard and exciting is the process of understanding reality by rediscovering an aspect right in front of you while talking about something as ordinary as a cup of tea. Such conversations could possibly go for hours if not interrupted by anything urgent. During these rediscoveries, he would discover something new personally too and announce it right there. And he did it with such ease, like any master craftsman, that it would be impossible for you to forget him. He had an amazing skill of establishing the truth very early in a conversation, so that one may find real motive and clarity of thought to move ahead. Over the long conversations I had with him, there were some recurring topics which I have found to be worth highlighting. Architecture is the science and art of transformations. This definition liberates the term architecture from the built environment, or specifically buildings, and brings the focus to the word transformation. When a structure is completely built and is inhabited by people, it still transforms through the day and night, and that's what constitutes its architecture. In fact, the kind of stasis imposed by restrictions in historical monuments, keeping them only visually accessible to the community, is something Ashish Ganju objected and advocated a more alive interpretation of history. While architecture is the science and art of transformations, it is very important to pay close attention to the tools with which these transformations are brought about. Because every tool not only transforms the external world, but the internal world of the tool holder too. He used to say that we must choose our tools very carefully to be the ones that increase our humanity over those that decrease our humanity. Spontaneous action as a design method. Of all his lessons, I found this to be the most valuable. Irrespective of the fact that there are architects and planners around to devise them or not, communities spontaneously design all the time. The role of an architect is not to impose their formally trained design method onto these ongoing spontaneous designs, but to facilitate them with their knowledge and training. These spontaneous actions emerge out of a collective consciousness of a community and must be respected. To conclude, I would say, rest in peace, Professor Ganju. You shall continue to live through the transformations you have brought single handedly in the minds of many of us.
Ashish had a huge network of friends, in all kinds of disciplines. There are artists, film people, spiritualists, and as you say it, and history, political science, anthropology. And he was very fond of discussing things. It was not a kind of a person that Ashish was sitting in his studio and drafting his and making essays. It was not like that. He was actually interested in exploring that idea, bouncing it off other people, getting their contributions. And this became a very important bond, not only academically, but from a human point of view, from person to person. And this was a very important thing which I continue to feel as a feature of Ashish's life. He was so much involved in the work that he was very uncomfortable with the idea of holiday. He never wanted to go on a holiday. He said, what will I do? This family is going there. And he was a family man. But, and he loved everybody in the family. He said, but they're all going to some place. I don't know what to do. So it was a very interesting thing. And it must have given him some kind of solace to his thinking mind, which never stopped moving.
Ashish's idea of collective life was really friendship and family as two sides of the same coin. All friends were part of family, and all family were part of the friendship circle. I think this combination, or this amalgamation, actually brought a lot of conviviality into just having a conversation with Ashish. I would get phone calls at 12 o'clock at night. I have an idea. And then again, 6 o'clock in the morning. And then he would say, oh, look, I have another call. I'll call you back. And then I would say, I have another call. I'll call you back. And the conversation went on.
Yes.
Despite of life's engagements, the conversation didn't stop. And that was such a wonderful experience to be in conversation with someone, and it made you also feel like a family and friend.
Yeah, and this was like he could host us in such a wonderful way because he wanted to talk to people. So I remember the lunches at his house where so much food would have been prepared and such enjoyment of both the food and the conversation would be taking place, including people from his family. His wife would be there, his sister would sometimes be there, and all of us would be enjoying a conversation, which was a high level of thought process. At the same time, we would be enjoying his hospitality. And the same when he came as a guest to your house. And I remember he's lived in this house of mine, and he would be, in the morning, he would be alive with a presence. And he would, at the breakfast table, he would radiate a kind of presence which was rare in most guests. And I think this is something that we valued very much in Ashish.
Writing a remembrance would mean that I would have to accept the fact that Bapu was no longer with us. I didn't want to do it, managed to avoid doing it in the 2 remembrances last week, but couldn't avoid this one. My father was my teacher and guide and so much more. The one person whose advice I would always seek no matter the issue, even though I will admit to not always agreeing with or following it. And he was good with that. Although Bapu wouldn't often admit it, he was okay with the difference in our opinion. He always taught us to be independent thinking people, to never follow the herd, and gave us the strength and confidence to achieve our dreams. I had very few childhood memories generally. One of my earliest memories is that of my 7th birthday and being presented with a bicycle which I was thrilled about. And I remember being excited and scared to ride it at the same time, and how Bapu just walked and ran behind me till I had the confidence to ride it on my own. A usually soft and understated person, Bapu was not a big believer of public display of affection, but he made sure we knew his thoughts on an important issue. Growing up, his office was either a floor up or down the road, and we would go and hang around and watch him work his kids. For us, he was also always around without actually being in your face. He set high standards for himself and for us, and it wasn't easy to get a word of praise from him growing up. And if you crossed the line, you would be sure of getting an earful. But each earful would always end up being a story or a narration of events and experiences and meander into a teaching. The importance of discipline, good habits, valuing your family, and a good education was stressed by him all throughout our childhood. Any chance he would get to give us a lecture about it, he would. No matter where we were, no matter with whom, he would let us know how he felt. The first time I had a serious disagreement with him was at college admission time. I wanted to do political science honors, and my choice of college was Hindu College at Delhi University. Bapu said I should go to LSR, Lady Shri Ram College, as it had a better faculty, which was important. The thought of going to an only girls' college seemed like a formidable task. We fought and fought, but he wouldn't budge. He would tell me that it doesn't matter what course I did at university, but the college was very important. And why should I go to a second-rate college when I could go to the best college? It was the whole experience that was important, and for that I would have to go to the best place that is. That was probably the first and the last time he told me what to do. Of course, it took me many years to realize the importance of what he said at that time. I now explain the same thing to my children. Looking back at the last 3 decades, I can't remember any other such time, be it the choice of my career, internships, work, or my personal life. It was all left up to me. He was always there to discuss and listen to my choices and options and tell me what he thought about them. But he didn't tell me what to do or how to do it. He was just around to gently guide me and did not hesitate to tell me what I was doing wrong or tell me his thoughts about it. I can only imagine how the students at TVB school would have benefited from the same learning. Bapu was always working on a cause. He would call me up and tell me how so-and-so institution or person was being unjust and how, as a lawyer, I should help or use my expertise to help those who couldn't help themselves. While listening to Bapu's colleagues and peers speak at the TVB School Remembrance last week, I realized some very important things. The qualities that were talked about them were the fact that, 1, if he were to put his mind to something, he would go on and do it and ensure that it would be done. He would find a solution to the problem at hand, whether with inside or outside the box thinking. The other thing was about how he was a moral and ethical compass for a lot of them, both his students and his peers. And also that he strived to create thinking human beings, people who were not just cogs in a wheel, but people who would go out there and make a difference. Throughout his life, whether it was his family, including his extended family, his work, his students from all over, all the people who were privileged to have interacted with him or spent time with him at some point or another imbibed those values from him. And I can proudly say I'm one of them. whether it was his tirelessly working from morning to night, even after the age of 75 years, or the causes he took up for benefiting thousands of people, he did it with the same enthusiasm and vigor. Possibly the fact that people would benefit being the driving force for him. I sincerely hope that his work can be continued by some of the people here today. I know he would have liked that. My cycle story really sums up how I remember my father. Always being around to support and guide me, and prevent me from falling or even faltering. Just being there, no questions asked. The task to go on without his support is daunting, to say the least. But I know I will, because I know he is out there watching, and I will have to learn to hear his voice in my head. Thank you. I would now like to thank all of you today who have spent so much time in the last 3 weeks to organize this remembrance for Bapu. We are indeed privileged to have heard all of you speak. I hope we can continue his legacy together in times to come. Thank you.
You see, it starts actually with getting, in any architectural work, when you look at the problem, the architectural problem, conventionally speaking, you have a site and you have a program. When you put the two things together, then you get architecture out of it. You have to have a site and you have to have a program. This is a conventional view. Today, you people might say because of artificial intelligence, you can do away with the site and the program, but I'm not going into that area at all. So even now, the issue is of site and program, and to program actually works on the basis of certain values. You have to discover what are the values which suit that particular situation, which means once again that you have to look at the symbols which will reciprocate or which will mirror life around you. You can convert a symbol into a architectural proposal. You can't convert a value into an architectural proposal. A value is a generalized understanding of life. But if you can reduce your values or transform your values or describe your values in terms of certain symbols, those symbols can certainly be transformed into built reality.
Thank you.